Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Share the adventures of our early pioneers as we explore the development of the Pacific Northwest and beyond. With your host, Mike Roberts, and historian Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee, and today we're heading into I can't believe we've missed this piece of country. I guess Golden would be the best way to describe the general area.
Well, we held it, Mike, and we're going into the shadow of the Rockies. We're going into mountains that run up over 10,000 feet. It's an area of British Columbia that's remote. It's remarkably beautiful, and some of these shots we'll show you just to introduce this is really quite amazing.
How people survived going into this country. It is precipitous. It denies you access.
That's right.
This is, what, the Elko River?
That's the Elko River, and that's in the East Kootenai country, and not precisely around the area we're going into, but in the general area.
Well,
and that, of course, is Sand Creek, and gives you an idea. Very difficult country to traverse. And the next shot is actually, that's from the Sitting Bull mine cabin, looking out at the view from the Sitting Bull, and that's Mount Nelson.
Look at that. And now a miner would look up, or a prospector would look up at that hillside and say, that looks like a string or a quartz or something. Right. And it could be 8,000 feet above him. He'd need to...
And almost impassable.
And yet he'd still go there.
Oh, sure he would.
Spectacular daredevils.
They would line in to check some of those veins.
Line in, meaning?
Take a rope down to check them.
Just to get there.
Just to get there.
And into this country, obviously the railway's going to come through here sometime or another.
Of course.
Here's the town. Oh, first of all, before the town, the Illecillewaet River.
Yeah.
What a great name.
Yeah, Indian name. And beautiful river. But rivers cascading out of the Rockies all through that western slope of the Rockies. And, of course, we have towns all through there as well. This one we're concentrating on Golden area, general area. Golden was called Cache originally, but there was a little town down the way that said they were Silver City, so Golden says, we'll go one better. We are the Golden City, and of course that was shortened to Golden. And this is an early view of Golden, and it was strategically located, Mike. It was at the Kicking Horse River where it drops into the Columbia. And of course the Columbia takes that wide loop and eventually goes hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so Golden was very, very important when the railway was coming through.
All right. Great. That shot's evocative, too, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
The mountains, the way that snow comes down, because as if the country weren't rugged enough just up and down, they get 20 feet of snow in there.
Yeah, it's a very heavy snowbed.
So Golden and area, where we're going to be going to today when we come back in 2 minutes for more Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee, Golden and area, the place we're going into. But whenever we talk about a place, and you seem to have an affinity for characters, and this place seems to be chock-a-block filled with characters.
Yeah. It had remittance men, Mike. It had hide hunters. It had miners. It had nicknames galore. Nicknames, some of the miners, there was Buffalo Bill Moore.
Buffalo Bill, was that a kind of a common name in those days?
Pretty common nickname.
Okay.
A lot of
anything to recommend
around.
Buffalo Bill Moore besides a neat name?
No, but I mean every miner had a nickname.
Sure.
I mean there was Tenace Bob, which Tenace means in the Chinook language, which is kind of a patois, Indian patois, means small or insignificant. Well, the locals didn't like that at all. They called him Tin-Ass Bob, which he didn't like. He in turn didn't like very much either. Then there was the Banjo Kid.
Banjo Kid.
Yeah, because he was one of these wandering troubadours and actually got shot to death in a house of prostitution. And that was not unusual in Golden. Golden was a very, very tough area in the early years. There's not much doubt about that.
Had a short career.
Banjo Kid had a very short career.
Okay.
And there was Cinnamon Bill Clement. He was another prospector. So you had all sorts of individuals, Mike, who were gravitating to this particular town. It was a magnet. First of all, it was on the edge of the frontier. The railroad was coming through. They thought they could make a stake. And, of course, a lot of miners were coming in. And this great shot of Manuel Denard. And the Daynards are still in this country. They're down in that Trout Lake area, which is, a fair distance away. But this is one of the pack trains that brought the supplies in prior to the railroad coming into Golden.
And you can just see the snow beginning to come in there?
And Golden was called Cache at first, C-A-C-H-E, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But then they assumed the name Golden, which they thought to be very grandiose and would be the way to go. And this is Golden's original main street. Pretty rough and ready, not much doubt about it.
Look at that. These used blue ribbon tea bags on there. I mean,
sure.
they must have got big money from the Lipton Company to paste that all over
yeah.
the front of that building. And the Golden and East Kootenai Trading Company
Yeah,
Limited.
it was a big company, actually, at one
Isn't
time.
that a
Yeah.
neat show? And they've got, even though there's all that snow on the ground, they got those empty kitchen chairs
Sure,
out there
sure.
to just sit in front there
Sure.
and enjoy.
Yeah, and it was kind of interesting because they had all sorts of diversions. Now, this is a shot here of a couple on Hospital Creek.
Now, this may be offensive to some, but this is from the turn of the century.
This is what happened in Golden at the turn of the century, and this woman is very, very proud. She's probably bagged her first bear.
And she's got a big lever action Winchester there.
Probably a Winchester, yeah.
And look at that. That is an
Yeah.
amazing. And she's striking the pose of...
Sure.
Well,
the great game hunter, of course, you know. And you know, it's interesting because they had a lot of diversions, and one of the diversions I was reading about when I was looking over Golden, and they always had horse races. Well, they had a different horse race in Golden, and this was called the cigar race. And you had to, first of all, mount your horse, light your cigar, and then it was a kind of an oval track, and you ran from stake to stake, and it was 300 yards and then 300 yards back. And the first one to make it around the far stake and back to the other stake and touch it with a cigar still lit won the race and usually won some money. So there's fairly heavy bets laid down. Well, there was a guy called Nicholson. He mounted his horse. Frank Nicholson wasn't a very good rider, and the dust was so thick, he headed where he thought the stake was, and an Indian rider got away ahead of him, and he was coming back, and they didn't see each other. Well, it was head-to-head collision between the two horses. One of the horses was killed, the Indian broke his leg, and needless to say, Frank did not finish the race, nor did the Indian, and the Indians usually won the race.
So cigar race. This is a cigar race.
Yeah, and you had to,
Maybe
cigar had to be lit. There's no doubt about
cigar
it.
races after that one, perhaps.
Yeah.
That might have been the last cigar race.
Yeah, no, it wasn't, actually. They continued the cigar races. There were some great horses in that country, and the Indians brought in some cayuses, which usually won the race. And there were other raw diversions, of course, in a railroad town and in a mining town. There's not much doubt it was a mining town. They had, at one time, 4 or 5 houses of questionable repute there, with some of the inhabitants like Dutch Les and Stilts and various other nicknames.
Not only
given
the
to the
men
girls.
had nicknames, but the ladies had nicknames.
Ladies of leisure usually did have a nickname, right?
Dutch Liz
Yeah.
and Stilts. Interesting.
Yeah.
Codring. And the railway was coming into town, you say?
The railway was coming in and was coming down to the Kicking Horse, and there's an example there of one of the shots showing some of the country the railroad goes through, and really quite remarkable. And of course, they had to have a station there, and Golden was emblazoned on the station in no uncertain terms at all.
There's an architecture that ties this country together
Sure.
as well as almost anything.
Yeah, and then you had, and of course, where the railroad didn't go, there weren't many roads through, so the next mode of operation and transportation were the stern-wheelers. And this gives you an idea of one of the stern-wheelers here, and this is the Duchess, one of the stern-wheelers that came down from Golden. That's on Lake Windermere. And interesting, everyone liked the stern-wheeler, even in those days, right to today. People go back and ride the stern-wheelers that have been restored. And of course, in Golden, it was a big trip to go right down the Columbia into Lake Windermere and right to Windermere City itself, or Windermere Town, and gamble on the way down and drink significant quantities of various types of liquor. And usually they came back broke, and it was kind of an unwritten agreement. If you spent all your money in Windermere or one of the places on the way down, they would give you free transportation on the way back.
Well, that
Which
was
they did.
sporting of those people.
I thought so.
Yeah?
Yeah.
There were some characters. Who was the guy? The top hat here reminds me of him.
J.C. Green.
And he...
Yeah. J.C. Green was actually a hotelier. And there were 4 hotels in Golden in the early years. One was the Columbia, one was the Queen's, and J.C. Green was manager of the Queen's. And then there was the Golden Hotel and the Russell House as well. So those are the 4 big ones. And they were all vying for the business. And, of course, you had to greet the train. Well, J.C. Green went one step farther. He wore a top hat, he wore white gloves, and he wore what is called a clawhammer jacket. And he looked very resplendent indeed, and made quite an impression on the passengers who had to stay over in Golden. And so most of them, of course, went to his hotel, which was the Queen's.
Well,
but there was stiff competition from the other hotels as well.
but I could see this man with the top
Yeah.
hat, and you called it a clawhammer. Or
Yeah.
some people call it a swallowtail coat. with a
Swallowtail, yeah.
Same. I love the clawhammer. That's far more
Well, of course.
minor-esque.
Well,
than,
of course, you'd never use the words swallowtail in Golden. No doubt about it.
And also lumbering. Now, usually we hardly ever talk about lumbering in this show because gold is so much more interesting. But look at the size of that mill taking off the lumber of the mountains
that's
around.
a later shot, but it just gives you an example. That's the Columbia River Lumber Company. And it was a big operation, several hundred men employed all the way around in the area just from moving a continuous supply of wood out of that particular area.
And by train. I was unaware that they had railway logging.
They had their own logging trains and their own track and everything else, yeah.
Look at that. They're just hauling that out of there.
Sure.
The Columbia Lumber Company, Columbia River Lumber Company. And, of course, I mean, gold and silver and all sorts of other things attract. There was some placer, but the wealth of this area wasn't necessarily placer.
Well, what usually happens, Mike, is your placer men come in first. And they looked around, and there were several creeks, Porcupine Creek and Canyon Creek. This is a shot of Canyon Creek, probably 1880s. And you can tell it's pretty good gold there by the flat rocks. And usually when your rocks tend to flatten out rather than be chunky, your gold is usually a little bit better. So the good miners who knew what they were looking for looked for this. Some hundreds of ounces, probably several thousand ounces came out of Canyon Creek overall, Mike, but that's about all.
And this is the way the town looked at around the turn of the century.
Yeah.
And once again, you say this is the confluence of the Columbia River and
the Kicking Horse.
And the Kicking Horse.
Yeah.
And there you have Golden, the mountains all surrounding it. Just
and people moved to Golden. Many of them stayed there for a lifetime. They'd never moved away, including the remittance men, which is rather interesting. They didn't go back to England. They stayed in Golden.
Well, there had to be two things that did that. I mean, it had to be, A, sustain them from an industrial point of view, but was it also something about the grandeur of the place?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, gosh, it's marvelous. When you go through that area, even today, I mean, we take it for granted because we're from British Columbia. Other people in the world don't take it for granted. They can't believe it. And it really is quite spectacular.
Now, there are some great mines in this area, but they weren't placer. What were they looking for?
Mostly lead, zinc, and silver. There were a few gold mines, but mostly lead, zinc, and silver. And one of the most prominent was the old Monarch, which was up Mount Stephen, and it's east of Field. It's just a few miles out of Field. But they looked up on that mountain, virtually precipitous. They saw a vein up there, and they had to go out on this, Mike, and it was over 1,000 feet straight down. You do not slip on that trail, and this is an example. They mined this particular mine, this is the Monarch, for about 60 years, 50 or 60
And what were they getting out of silver?
They got silver, lead, and zinc, and it was a very, very good producer indeed. And, you know, it's funny about the mining fraternity. I have a lot of time for some of the mining fraternity, at least 50% of them. And there were some very, very interesting guys. One of them was a guy called Robert Bruce. He had connections in Ontario. He was going to come out to Golden and make his, or in that part of the Columbia River Valley, and make his fortune. He tried and lost tens of thousands of dollars in a little mine he tried to promote. Wired back to a guy called Hammond, who I believe lived in Toronto, and Hammond said, okay, we'll try you once more. He spent another $10,000 or $20,000 in another mine that didn't pan out. He wired Hammond again. I think Hammond had gone to school with him, and Hammond said, okay, we'll give it one last try. So he went up a little valley called the Paradise Basin, and there's a shot of the Paradise Basin.
Guess you'd call that a cirque in mountain terminology.
Yes, you probably would.
Up there.
Yeah, and he was one of the first in there, and he had enough knowledge by this time that he found a very, very nice vein of lead, zinc, and silver. And he staked a mine, which he called naturally the Paradise Mine. And out of it, he paid back his backer, who made a very, very handsome profit. He took out $375,000 in profit for himself, which is a lot of money in those days. It produced 100,000 ounces of silver as well as millions and millions of pounds of gold, of lead every year. And then he sold it for $375,000. And the interesting thing was, he became the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia.
That Robert Bruce.
Yes.
And so he gets a mine, he gets a mill, and this shot shows how they move the ore from one to the other. That's called rawhiding.
That's called rawhiding, and you can only do that in the winter. And, of course, it's easier to move the ore in the winter than it is in the summer, because otherwise it's packed out. And rawhide, you can go a little faster. Now, once in a while, the horses would put the brakes on. If it was overloaded, they would just stop. And sometimes the mules would do the same thing, but horses are mules. They interchanged. And, but it worked well, and it worked all through the Kootenays, no doubt about it, Mike.
Okay. Take a break here. We'll be back in a second to tell you some more stories about Golden and area. Don't go away. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barley. We're talking about the area around Golden. We're roaming a little, but they call the lake north of Golden now Kinbasket Lake. What was the reason for that?
Well, the Kinbasket family are the leading Indian family in that particular area. Some Shuswap connections there as well as Kootenai Indian connections. And the Kinbasket is kind of interesting because in the early days in Golden, when they found a live mountain goat, they could get $500, which was a lot of money then for a live mountain goat. the Kinbasket family actually was able to run down and capture mountain goats. And they did. They brought them in live, shipped them out, got their $500. So the Indians were very inventive, and they were also very proud. They were rather interesting. The sheriff in Golden, a guy named Redgrave, and Redgrave weighed 300 pounds. So he made his mark. There's no doubt about that. And he was a pretty good lawman. He was eventually shot to death just outside New Westminster, by the way. And but anyway, he had trouble in 1887 because there was a double murder in the Wild Horse country. 2 miners were killed. Their gold pokes were taken, and all the gold therein. And they blamed it on the Kootenai Indians, which was, by the way, incorrect. And they found out later it was incorrect. So they jailed 2 of the Kootenai Indians, and certainly one of them was put in a jail in the Wild Horse, and he was called Capula, and the other one was Little Isidore. And Little Isidore was no relation to the chief of the Kootenai Indians at that time, down around Tobacco Plains, which was Chief Isidore. Very proud man, and he had at his command several hundred men. So he didn't like the way things were shaping up, so he took 24 or 25 of his warriors, armed with Winchesters. They rode up from Tobacco Plains, up to the Wild Horse, and rode beyond Fort Steele, what is now Fort Steele. Wasn't there then, by the way. That was Galbraith's Ferry, and rode right up into the Wild Horse, into the diggings. Asked the jailer there to let the prisoner go. He refused. They then took the law into their own hands, and they broke down the jail door, and they put Capula on a horse and rode away without anyone raising a hand. And very interesting. I can see them now riding into that area. They knew the country extremely well. Then they brought in the Northwest Mounted Police under Sam Steele, and decided to lay the law down to the Indians. They examined the case and found that it indeed was not Capula. There was no evidence at all, or Little Isidore. So kind of interesting. And you had some very fascinating characters in this area.
That's neat. I mean, they knew the injustice.
Sure.
And they were found to be right. And, I mean, that's stalwart and fundamentally principled people.
But some of the rogues got away. There was a man of the cloth in that Golden area, whose name shall not be mentioned because he has relatives still in the area. And he decided he would form the Laborers Co-op Silver and Gold Mining Company, actually Gold and Silver Mining Company, and he would have a smelter there, and it would smelt all the ore coming in from the various mines, whether it was the Monarch or the Paradise or scores of mines in the Windermere Mining District or the Golden Mining District. And it sounded great. Now, the first step, this guy was very, very clever, and he was a scoundrel. He bought the Golden Era newspaper and changed it to the Golden Star. And the Golden Star then became the propaganda tool that he used very efficiently in the particular area. So everybody in Golden who had a few dollars invested in the Co-op Silver and Gold Association, and they waited with breathless expectation for the first brick to come out of the smelter. And the smelter ran, I believe it was about 4 or 5 hours.
He actually built a smelter.
He did build a very, very small smelter. It was a sham. And he was a con artist of the highest order indeed. And evidently he made millions and millions of dollars. He was never arraigned. He took a lot of money out of the valley, out of the Golden area, the Windermere area, the Invermere area, and all those areas down in that particular part of the Rockies. And he never was brought to justice, but rather interesting.
Would you know what his destination might have been after he'd fleeced the public?
Actually, I think he died eventually in Minneapolis, which is far from Golden indeed.
Yes.
His riches were intact, and he was never brought to justice, which is rather interesting.
We talked a little bit already about some of the hotel owners, but there's a great story just to wrap today up.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a very fascinating guy, a guy called Jack Buckram, and he was a druggist. And Jack Buckram had a kind of a puckish sense of humor, very interesting guy, and he was always playing practical jokes. And one day he stayed in the Queen's Hotel, and one day the operator of a general store there, a guy called Warren, and you can see it in this photograph.
Now,
Warren's general store.
We're going to go detail. You've seen this photograph already today,
sure.
but there's the general store.
Yeah, and the Queen's Hotel.
The Queen's Hotel.
And then there's an empty space.
There's an empty space between those two, yeah.
Well, a druggist came in, at least not a druggist, but a jeweler came in, and he decided he didn't want to pay. He would just park his little shack there, and he would sell his goods and so on. And people didn't like it, and the Queen's Hotel didn't like it, and Warren didn't like it because it took away from the tone of that particular part of Golden. So he was discussing it with Buckram. Buckram said, well, we should blow it up. We should dynamite it. Warren said, okay, I'll get the dynamite. You did dynamite. He says, okay. And so they waited, and they got the dynamite, and one night Warren just packed the dynamite over to Buckram, and Buckram put a fuse out his window in the Queen's Hotel, and it led down across the ground. He waited till nobody, right into the jewelry store, and the dynamite was on the other end, and he waited till nobody was in sight, and he touched the fuse off with a nice little match, and it blew it all to smithereens, blew out some of the windows in the Queen's Hotel, by the way, and everyone knew who had done it, and not a word was said. A very, very interesting guy, and he had a sense of justice as well, and he was a strong, very strong man. He wasn't huge, but they were arguing on the platform at the station once, and they were trying to pick up, two men were trying to pick up a 300-pound piece of machinery, and they couldn't. And Buckram came and says, what the hell's going on here? Well, we're trying to pick this up, Jack. And he said, oh, that's easy, he said, and put down his thumb and his forefinger and picked it up, 300 pounds, and carried it off the platform. They were absolutely dumbfounded. Because here was a guy who didn't look very big, strong as a horse.
Obviously, any story you told about Buckram would carry.
Yeah, sure, and he had a sense of justice as well.
Okay.
There was a merchant there, a Chinese merchant called Sam Lee, and everyone played a lot of jokes on Sam Lee, and Sam Lee was a very decent guy, and he was arraigned for some problem in town, and he hadn't done it. Buckram had done it, okay, because Buckram was inclined this way. And so anyway, he went to court, and Sam Lee said, no, I didn't do this, in his broken English. Very, very fine guy. And everyone sat there and watched, you know, the whole, and of course they packed the courtroom because this was a diversion. It was like theater.
Sure,
and the judge said, no, I'm fining you $50. And so Buckram got up and reached into his pocket and took out a $50 bill, and he said, Your Honor, he said, it wasn't Sam Lee, it was me, and here's the $50, and turned around and walked out of court.
No contempt of court charges,
No
however.
contempt of court, no. That was the way life was in old Golden in the 1890s and the turn of the century.
What a neat story.
Yeah.
And today when you go in there, you come through the passes from Field,
Sure
you come down the Rogers Pass, past Kibasket Lake, and into, and there's Golden in this beautiful little valley, and the railway is in there, and you just see the majesty of this place.
Oh yeah, it's a majestic area. All that East Kootenai, right up from Lake Windermere, all through that country is really quite spectacular.
Got one little artifact here. We always say to ourselves, and this one you don't know anything about.
No, I don't.
All of this is Windermere and something mere and this mere and that
Invermere and Windermere, and this one's
Cliffmere.
Yeah,
the
we don't
Hotel
know.
Cliffmere.
Yeah.
Is this from where was the Hotel Cliffmere? We don't know.
I don't know. I could look up some of the archives material in the provincial archives and perhaps find out from a British Columbia directory of the turn of the century or just after. But if anyone from Invermere or Windermere or Golden knows, please let me know.
Tell us about the Hotel Cliffmere.
Yeah.
It is a mystery, especially for those of you living in room 25. Thank you very much. Interesting
welcome.
Stories about Golden and area.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoy that area the next time you go through. See you next time on Gold Trails and Ghost Town.